Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into something pretty amazing.
Let's do it.
Okay, today we're going deep into fetal development and the whole world of genetics.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we're going to witness that transformation, from a single cell all the way to a complex human being.
And it's a process that still blows my mind, even after all these years of studying it.
I bet. There's so much that happens before a woman even knows, that she's pregnant.
Right. It's incredible.
So let's break it down into stages.
Okay.
We start with the zygotic stage.
Uh-huh.
Then we move on to the blastocyst, to the embryonic stage, and finally the fetal stage.
Lots to unpack in each of those.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I've got to admit, some of these facts just blew me away.
Well, I think people don't realize how much we actually take for granted about this whole process. Like, did you know it takes 5 hours for fertilization to even be complete?
Wow.
That little sperm's got a journey ahead of it.
It's like a microscopic obstacle course.
Exactly.
And then once that sperm does reach the egg, it's the father's sperm that determines the sex.
That's right. It's all about those chromosomes.
It is. It is. And then there's the placenta, which is often thought of as just a filter.
Oh, it is so much more than that.
So much more.
It's like a hormone powerhouse.
I know, right? It's incredible.
Huge impacts on the mother's body.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
The miracle of conception.
It really is a miracle.
So we have sperm meeting egg, but how does that single fertilized cell actually, become a person?
Well, it's definitely intricate, but it all begins with fertilization, right? When that sperm and egg fuse together. And that creates what we call the zygote.
The zygote.
And that's a single cell. But now it has the full set of chromosomes, 46.
Wow.
Half from mom, half from dad.
Okay.
And that little zygote doesn't waste any time. It starts dividing immediately as it makes its way down the fallopian tube. We call this process cleavage.
So it's on the move right from day one.
Exactly. And as it divides, it forms a solid ball of cells, which we call a morula.
A morula.
Yep. And then fluid starts to enter that morula, and that creates a hollow ball of cells, which we call the blastocyst.
The blastocyst.
Yeah, and that's a crucial step because the blastocyst is what will implant in the uterus.
Ah, okay. Now, I remember learning about a protective layer around the egg.
Yes.
What role does that play?
You're talking about the zona pellucida.
Yes.
Yeah, it acts like a gatekeeper.
Okay.
It makes sure only one sperm can fertilize the egg, and it also helps guide the blastocyst towards the uterus for implantation.
So it's like a bodyguard and a guide, all in one.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. The cells inside the blastocyst, they don't stay identical. They actually start to differentiate.
Oh.
Which means they specialize into different cell types that will eventually form the embryo and the placenta. We're talking about the very foundation of a human being starting to form.
So we've gone from one single cell to this blastocyst that's ready to implant and is already forming different types of cells.
Isn't that incredible?
It's amazing. It really is. Now, I also remember those 3 germ layers.
Yes.
Do those come into play around this time?
Absolutely. The ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm.
Right.
They're like the primary building blocks for the whole body.
Wow.
The ectoderm will go on to form the brain, the spinal cord, skin, and sense organs.
So all the things that connect us to the outside world.
Exactly. What about the mesoderm?
Yeah, what does the mesoderm do?
So the mesoderm, that gives rise to the bones, the muscles, the heart, and the circulatory system. It's all about structure and movement.
Okay. And lastly, the endoderm.
The endoderm, that forms the lining of the digestive system, the lungs, and other internal organs. So that's keeping us functioning on the inside.
It's like this incredible origami project.
It really is.
Unfolding inside the womb, with each layer playing a crucial role.
Every single one is vital.
So we're in the embryonic stage now.
We are.
Wow. So much is happening so quickly. For our student nurses out there listening, why is it so important for them to understand this stage?
Well, understanding these early stages is really essential for us as nurses because it helps us identify any potential problems early on so that we can, intervene if necessary.
Makes sense.
For instance, knowing how the neural tube forms is super important for preventing neural tube defects.
Okay.
And those can have a huge impact on a child's health.
Right, of course. So we've got this embryo, all these germ layers forming organs, but it needs a lifeline, right, to keep growing. That's where the placenta comes in.
Exactly. Placenta is remarkable. Like the lifeline between the mother and the developing fetus. It makes sure there's a constant supply of oxygen, nutrients, gets rid of waste products.
Okay.
But here's the really amazing part. It also acts as a protective barrier, preventing the mother's immune system from attacking the fetus, like a highly specialized security system.
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So it's like a life support system and a bodyguard all in one.
Exactly.
Wow. And you mentioned earlier that it's also like a hormone powerhouse.
Oh, it is. The placenta produces a whole bunch of different hormones, each with a very specific job to do.
Okay.
One of the first ones is human chorionic gonadotropin, better known as HCG.
HCG.
That's what pregnancy tests detect.
So that's what causes those two lines to show up.
That's it. And HCG is vital because it helps maintain the corpus luteum,
Right.
which produces progesterone, and progesterone is absolutely crucial for keeping the pregnancy going.
Okay.
Then there's human placental lactogen, or HPL, which helps regulate the mother's metabolism
Okay.
and gets her breasts ready for breastfeeding.
Wow.
And then we can't forget about estrogen and progesterone.
Right.
The placenta produces a ton of these, and they're responsible for so many of the changes women experience during pregnancy.
So the placenta is really running the show, orchestrating this whole process.
It's a master multitasker.
It really is. But why is it so important for nurses to understand this?
Well, understanding the placenta's role is crucial for nurses because it allows us to educate pregnant women,
Okay.
about lifestyle choices, potential risks. For example, how substances like alcohol and drugs can actually cross the placental barrier,
Right.
and that could potentially harm the fetus.
Yeah, it really highlights how important prenatal care is.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have this incredible placenta, keeping the fetus alive, helping it thrive.
Uh-huh.
But what about the circulatory system?
Oh, good question.
I mean, it's not breathing yet, right? So how does that work?
That's a great question, and it brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of fetal development, fetal circulation.
Okay.
So because those lungs aren't functioning yet, the placenta actually steps in and takes on the role of the lungs.
Oh, wow.
It provides oxygenated blood to the fetus. To do that, the fetus has these special detours in its circulatory system,
Okay.
and those detours allow the blood to bypass the lungs and the liver, which are still developing.
So it's like a temporary rerouting system for the blood.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
We call these detours shunts.
Shunts.
Yeah. And they ensure that the blood flows efficiently to where it's needed most.
It's amazing how the body adapts like that.
It's a marvel of adaptation.
But then what happens when the baby takes its first breath?
Oh, that first breath is monumental.
Yeah.
It triggers a whole cascade of changes. The lungs inflate, the pressure changes in the heart. And those shunts we talked about, they start to close.
Just as like flipping a switch from fetal circulation to normal circulation.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a lot of change in such a short amount of time.
It really is.
I imagine that nurses play a really critical role, like monitoring newborns at that point.
Absolutely. We need to be on the lookout for any signs that those shunts aren't closing properly.
Okay.
Listening for heart murmurs. Things like that can give us clues about how the baby's transitioning.
So we've covered a lot of ground already. Fertilization, implantation, the amazing placenta, even the intricate detours of fecal circulation.
Amazing.
It is. But there's another key piece to the puzzle, genetics.
Right.
I have to admit, genetics can feel a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
But really, it's just about understanding the blueprint, the one that guides this entire process of fetal development. We should start with the basics: DNA, genes, chromosomes.
Okay, break it down for us. What are those exactly?
Well, think of DNA, that's deoxyribonucleic acid,
DNA.
as the master instruction manual for building and maintaining an organism.
Okay.
It's got all the information needed to make a unique individual.
So like a massive library with all the secrets of life.
I like that analogy. What about genes? How do those fit in?
Yeah, what about genes?
Well, genes are specific segments of DNA, and they code for particular traits. So think of them like chapters in that instruction manual,
Okay.
each one containing the instructions for a specific characteristic, like eye color
Oh, okay.
or blood type.
So DNA is the whole library. Genes are the individual chapters.
You got it. Now, where do chromosomes come in?
Yeah, where do those fit in?
Well, they're like the volumes that hold all those chapters.
Okay.
They're structures made of DNA and proteins, and humans have 23 pairs,
Okay.
one set from each parent.
Okay, that makes sense. So DNA is the library, chromosomes are the books, and genes are the chapters.
You got it.
Got it. But now I'm remembering these terms genotype and phenotype. Can you refresh my memory on those?
Absolutely. So genotype refers to an individual's actual genetic makeup, the specific genes they inherit from their parents, like the words written in those chapters.
Okay. And phenotype?
Phenotype is the outward expression of those genes, the traits we can actually see, like hair color, height.
So how those words translate into the story.
Exactly. And, just like in a story, there can be variations and
Okay.
sometimes surprises.
Like how someone might have the gene for brown eyes, but they actually have blue eyes.
Exactly. That's a great example. Gene expression is this complex process with constant interaction between genes and the environment.
Right.
And sometimes changes happen in the genetic code. We call those mutations.
Mutations, okay.
And those mutations can alter the instructions, which leads to variations in phenotype.
Interesting. So are all mutations bad?
Not necessarily. Some are harmless, maybe even beneficial, but others can lead to disease.
Okay.
And that brings us to inheritance patterns, how genes get passed down from parents to offspring.
Okay. Now this is where my brain starts to hurt a little bit. Remember those Punnett squares from biology class?
Oh, yeah, those can be tricky.
Dominant and recessive genes. It's been a while.
Don't worry, we'll refresh your memory. Let's start with autosomal dominant inheritance. In this pattern, just one copy of the abnormal gene is enough to cause the disorder. So if one parent has that gene, there's a 50% chance their child will inherit it.
So it's like a flip of a coin.
Yeah.
50-50 chance.
Exactly. Some examples of autosomal dominant disorders would be Huntington's disease
Right.
or polycystic kidney disease. Now, with autosomal recessive inheritance, you need two copies of that abnormal gene to cause the disorder.
Okay.
So if both parents are carriers, meaning they each have one normal gene and one abnormal gene, there's a 25% chance that their child will inherit both of those abnormal genes and have the disorder.
So the odds are lower, but it's still possible.
That's right. Examples of autosomal recessive disorders would be cystic fibrosis or sickle cell disease. Then we have X-linked inheritance,
Okay.
where the abnormal gene is on the X chromosome. And since females have two X chromosomes and males have one X and one Y, the inheritance patterns are different between the sexes.
This is where it gets a little tricky, right?
It can be. In X-linked recessive inheritance, males are more often affected because they only need one copy of that abnormal gene to express the disorder. Females would need two copies.
Okay.
Examples would be hemophilia or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And then you have X-linked dominant inheritance, which is less common. In this pattern, just one copy of the abnormal gene is enough to cause the disorder in both males and females.
Okay.
Fragile X syndrome is an example of that.
So we've got autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked recessive, and X-linked dominant. 4 ways these genes can impact health. Are there any other inheritance patterns we should know about?
Well, there's multifactorial inheritance. That's where it's not just one gene causing the condition. It's a combination of genetic and environmental factors.
So it's not always a simple one gene, one disorder type of thing.
It can be much more complex than that. Things like cleft lip or palate or spina bifida often fall into this category.
Wow. So much to consider.
There is.
All this information can be pretty overwhelming for expecting parents, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
What role does genetic counseling play in helping families navigate this?
Genetic counseling is an invaluable resource for couples, for understanding their genetic risks, making those informed decisions about family planning. It's all about empowering them with knowledge.
So who should consider seeking out genetic counseling? Is it for everyone, or are there specific situations where it's recommended?
Well, it's a good idea for anyone who's concerned about potential genetic risks. But it's especially recommended for women over 35, couples with a family history of genetic disorders, or those who've had, previous pregnancies affected by congenital anomalies.
Okay, so if someone decides to pursue genetic counseling, what can they expect during a session? What actually happens?
Well, the genetic counselor will start by gathering a detailed family history, often using what we call a pedigree. Think of it like a family tree, but it maps out genetic traits.
Interesting.
They'll discuss testing options, carrier screening, prenatal diagnostic tests, things like amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling. Really depends on their individual situation and concerns.
And it's not just about giving information, right? There's an emotional component to all of this, too.
Absolutely. It's also about providing emotional support and resources to help families navigate this information and make the choices that are right for them.
Right. It's a very personal and often, emotional journey.
It really is.
It sounds like genetic counseling plays a really crucial role in prenatal care, especially as our understanding of genetics continues to grow.
I think you're right. And nurses are really at the forefront of this. We have such a vital role to play in the genomic era.
I can see that.
Yeah.
We're often the first point of contact for families. So we need to be able to identify those who might benefit from genetic counseling and explain these complex concepts in a way that people understand. It's all about advocating for our patients, supporting them every step of the way.
Exactly. Nurses really need a solid understanding of genetics to navigate this new landscape of healthcare.
So what are some key things nurses should know? What kind of knowledge and skills are essential in this area?
Well, first and foremost, we need to be comfortable taking a detailed family history.
Okay.
That's often the first step in identifying any potential risks. Remember those pedigree charts we talked about?
Yes, like a family tree with a focus on health information.
Exactly. It's a lot more than just asking, does anyone in your family have heart disease?
Right, it's a lot more nuanced than that.
It is. We need to know about the age of onset for diseases.
Okay.
The specific causes of death for family members who've passed away.
Okay.
Any history of miscarriages, stillbirths, birth defects.
Wow.
We should also ask about their ethnic background, because some genetic conditions are more prevalent in certain populations.
Okay.
For instance, sickle cell disease is more common in people of African descent.
Right.
It's like detective work, really, piecing together clues to assess those genetic risks.
It sounds like it. So what happens if we, as nurses, uncover some red flags during this family history assessment? Do we start ordering genetic tests right away?
Not quite. Our role is really to educate and advocate, not to diagnose.
Okay.
If we do see any red flags, our next step is to refer the patient to a genetic specialist.
Okay.
For further evaluation and counseling, we can explain the different types of genetic tests, help them understand, the risks and benefits of each one.
So it's a collaborative approach.
It is.
Working hand in hand with genetic specialists to make sure they're receiving the most appropriate care. What are some examples of the genetic tests that might be ordered?
Well, there are several, depending on the situation. Carrier screening, for example, can tell us if a person carries a gene for a recessive disorder. This is particularly important for couples planning a family because it lets them know the risks of passing that disorder on to their children.
Right, like if both parents are carriers of cystic fibrosis.
Exactly. Then there are prenatal diagnostic tests like amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling. And those can detect chromosomal abnormalities or genetic disorders in a developing fetus. These are usually offered to women who are at increased risk, those over 35. Or with a family history.
Right. I imagine those tests can be pretty emotionally challenging.
Oh, they can be. And we have to remember that our role as nurses goes beyond just giving information. We need to be sensitive to the emotional impact of these tests and offer support throughout the process.
So what kind of support can we offer?
Well, just listening to their fears and concerns.
Okay.
Answering their questions honestly and openly. Making sure they have the information they need to make informed decisions. We can also connect them with support groups or other resources. Sometimes just having someone who understands what they're going through can make a huge difference.
It sounds like empathy and clear communication are crucial skills for nurses.
They really are.
Especially in this area. Being able to explain these complex genetic concepts in a way that's understandable, providing emotional support when they're, facing those difficult decisions.
Absolutely.
It's about finding that balance between knowledge, compassion, and advocacy.
You hit the nail on the head.
This deep dive is really emphasizing how important it is for us to stay up to date.
Oh, yeah.
On the latest advancements in genetics.
Absolutely.
It's a rapidly evolving field, and our knowledge needs to evolve right along with it.
Absolutely. Continuing education is key.
It is.
And, don't be afraid to reach out to genetic specialists. We're all in this together, working to provide the best possible care.
It's amazing to think how much our understanding of genetics has changed, even in recent years.
It is.
What are some of the most exciting advancements you've seen?
Well, one area I find particularly fascinating is pharmacogenomics.
Pharmacogenomics, what's that?
So that's all about how a person's genes can actually influence their response to medications.
Oh, wow.
It has the potential to really revolutionize how we prescribe and administer drugs.
Okay.
Leading to treatments that are more personalized and more effective.
So less trial and error.
Yeah.
More targeted therapies.
Exactly.
That would be incredible. It sounds like the future of healthcare is personalized medicine.
I think you're right, with genetics playing a key role.
And nurses are going to be right at the forefront.
We are.
Using our knowledge of genetics to advocate for our patients.
Absolutely.
It's definitely an exciting time to be a nurse. But with all these advances come some important ethical considerations as well.
Oh, for sure. Things like privacy and confidentiality. Those are big issues when we're talking about something as personal as genetic information.
It makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, what happens to that information once it's out there? Who has access to it? Could it be used against someone? Like by, I don't know, insurance companies or employers?
Those are very real concerns.
They are.
And luckily, we do have laws in place like the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA,
Okay.
which helps protect individuals from that type of discrimination.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So GINA helps prevent discrimination in terms of health insurance and employment.
Right.
But does it cover everything? Are there other areas where genetic discrimination could happen?
Well, unfortunately, there are still some gaps.
Okay.
GINA focuses mainly on health insurance and employment, but it doesn't address other areas where it could potentially occur, like life insurance or long-term care insurance.
So there's still work to be done
There is.
to make sure there's comprehensive protection for everyone.
Absolutely.
It also makes you think about, the ownership of genetic information.
That's a big one.
Does it belong to the person who was tested,
Yeah.
the company that did the test?
Right.
Or is it part of some, larger research database?
Those are tough questions.
They are.
That society is still figuring out. There are no easy answers. And it's something we need to keep discussing as our understanding of genetics and the technology evolves.
And then there's the issue of informed consent. How do we make sure that patients really understand what genetic testing means before they agree to it?
Informed consent is so important. We have to have open and honest conversations with our patients, making sure they're fully informed about the potential benefits, the risks of testing.
Right.
We need to clearly explain the types of information that could be revealed and what the potential impact of those results could be.
Right.
It's about empowering patients to make informed choices that really align with their values and beliefs.
What about testing for conditions that don't have a cure, like Huntington's disease?
Yeah.
Is it ethical to give someone that kind of information, knowing that it might cause them, a lot of anxiety and fear, but there's no solution?
That is a tough one.
It is.
And it sparks a lot of debate.
Yeah.
Some people believe that knowledge is power. Even if it's difficult to hear, they feel it's better to be aware, even if there's nothing you can do.
Right.
Others feel it's better not to know, especially if you can't change the outcome. Ultimately, it's a personal decision.
Yeah.
And we need to respect their choices.
Support them either way.
Exactly.
It sounds like genetic testing requires this really delicate balance between providing information and protecting patients from potential harm, both physical and emotional.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the science. It's about the human impact.
You're absolutely right. And as nurses, we have to be aware of these ethical considerations, advocate for our patients, always making sure their rights and well-being are protected.
We're their guides
Yeah.
in this complex landscape.
That's a great way to put it.
Wow, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's amazing how far we've come in understanding fetal development and genetics. But it's clear that we still have many challenges ahead, scientific and ethical.
We do, but with open discussions, thoughtful consideration, a commitment to ethical practices, I think we can really harness the power of this genetic knowledge.
And improve healthcare for everyone.
Exactly.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up for today.
Right.
From that first spark of life all the way to the implications of genetic testing, we've explored some truly awe-inspiring and thought-provoking topics. I hope this has given our listeners, especially our student nurses and faculty, a lot to think about. It's a field that's always evolving, and it's up to all of us to stay informed, have these important conversations, and advocate for ethical and compassionate care.
Well said.
Until next time, keep those brains firing.
And never stop
The
exploring.
wonders of science and healthcare.
I love it. But really, it's all about understanding that blueprint, the one that guides this whole process of fetal development. So let's start with the basics. DNA, genes, and chromosomes.
Okay, break it down for us. What are those exactly?
Well, think of DNA as the master instruction manual.
DNA.
Yeah, deoxyribonucleic acid. It has all the information needed to create a unique individual.
It's like a massive library filled with all the secrets of life.
I love that analogy. What about genes, then? How do those fit in?
Yeah, what about genes?
Well, genes are specific segments of DNA that code for particular traits.
Okay.
So think of them like chapters in that instruction manual. Each one has the instructions for a specific characteristic, like eye color or blood type.
Oh, okay. So DNA is the whole library, genes are the chapters.
You got it. Now, where do chromosomes come in?
Yeah, where do those fit in?
Chromosomes are like the volumes that hold all those chapters. There's structures made up of DNA and proteins, and humans have 23 pairs of them, one set from each parent.
Okay, that makes sense. So DNA is the library, chromosomes are the books, and genes are the chapters.
Got it. But now I'm remembering these terms, genotype and phenotype. Can you refresh my memory on those?
Absolutely. Genotype refers to the actual genetic makeup, the specific genes they inherit from their parents, like the words written in those chapters we were talking about.
Okay, and phenotype?
Phenotype is how those genes are expressed outwardly, the physical traits we see, like hair color or height. It's how those words translate into the actual story. And just like in a story, there can be variations and sometimes even surprises. So like how someone might have the gene for brown eyes, but they actually have blue eyes.
Exactly, that's a great example. Gene expression is complex. There's constant interaction between genes and the environment. And sometimes, changes occur in the genetic code, which we call mutations. And those mutations can alter the instructions, which leads to variations in phenotype.
Interesting. So are all mutations bad?
Not necessarily. Some mutations are harmless or even beneficial, but others can lead to disease. And that brings us to inheritance patterns, how genes are passed down from parents to their children.
Okay. This is where my brain starts to hurt a little bit. Remember Punnett squares from biology class?
Oh yeah, those can be a bit tricky.
Dominant and recessive genes. It's been a while.
Well, let's refresh your memory. Let's start with autosomal dominant inheritance. In this pattern, a single copy of the abnormal gene is enough to cause the disorder. So, if one parent has that gene, there's a 50% chance their child will inherit it.
So it's like a flip of a coin.
Yeah.
50-50 chance.
Exactly. Some examples of autosomal dominant disorders are Huntington's disease and polycystic kidney disease. Now, with autosomal recessive inheritance, you need 2 copies of the abnormal gene to cause the disorder. So if both parents are carriers, meaning they each have one normal gene and one abnormal gene, there's a 25% chance that their child will inherit 2 of those abnormal genes and therefore have the disorder.
So the odds are lower, but it's still possible.
That's right. Examples of autosomal recessive disorders include cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease. Then we have X-linked inheritance. This is where the abnormal gene is located on the X chromosome. And since females have 2 X chromosomes, while males have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome, the inheritance patterns differ between the sexes.
That's where it gets a little tricky, right?
It can be. In X-linked recessive inheritance, males are more likely to be affected because they only need 1 copy of the abnormal gene to express the disorder, whereas females would need 2 copies. Examples of X-linked recessive disorders would be things like hemophilia or Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And then we have X-linked dominant inheritance, which is less common, and in this pattern, a single copy of the abnormal gene on the X chromosome is enough to cause the disorder in both males and females. Fragile X syndrome is an example of an X-linked dominant disorder.
So we got autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked recessive, and X-linked dominant. 4 ways these genes can impact health. Are there any other inheritance patterns that we should be aware of?
Well, there's also multifactorial inheritance, where it's not just one gene that causes a health condition. It's a combination of genetic and environmental factors that contribute to the development of a condition. Things like cleft lip or palate or spina bifida often fall into this category.
So it's not always a simple, one gene equals one disorder type of thing.
It can be much more complex than that.
Right. All of this information can be pretty overwhelming for expecting parents, I imagine.
Whoa, absolutely.
What role does genetic counseling play in helping families navigate all of this?
Genetic counseling is a really valuable resource for couples who, want to understand their genetic risks and make those informed decisions about family planning. It's all about empowering them with knowledge.
So who should consider seeking out genetic counseling? Is it for everyone, or are there specific situations where it's particularly recommended?
Well, it's definitely a good idea for anyone who is concerned about potential genetic risks, but it's especially recommended for women over 35, couples with a family history of genetic disorders, or those who have had previous pregnancies that were affected by congenital anomalies.
Okay, so if someone decides to pursue genetic counseling, what can they expect during a session? What actually happens?
Well, the genetic counselor will start by gathering a detailed family history, often using what we call a pedigree. It's like a family tree, but it maps out the genetic traits within a family. And they'll discuss various testing options, like carrier screening or prenatal diagnostic tests like amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling. It really depends on the individual situation and their concerns.
And it's not just about giving information, right? There's an emotional component to all of this as well.
Absolutely. Genetic counseling is also about providing emotional support and resources to help families, kind of navigate this complex information and make the choices that are right for them. It's a very personal and often very emotional journey.
It sounds like genetic counseling plays a really crucial role in prenatal care, especially as our understanding of genetics continues to grow.
I think you're absolutely right. And nurses are really at the forefront of this. We have such a vital role to play in this genomic era.
I can see that. We're often the first point of contact for families, so we need to be able to identify those who might benefit from genetic counseling and explain these really complex concepts in a way that's understandable for people. It's all about advocating for our patients and supporting them every step of the way.
Exactly. Nurses really need a solid understanding of genetics to navigate this new landscape of healthcare.
So, what are some of the key things that nurses should know? What kind of knowledge and skills are really essential in this area?
Well, first and foremost, we need to be comfortable taking a detailed family history. That's often the first step in identifying any potential genetic risks. Remember those pedigree charts that we talked about?
Yes, like a family tree, but with, focus on health information.
Exactly. And it's a lot more than just asking, does anyone in your family have heart disease?
Right. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
It is. We need to ask about the age of onset for any diseases, the specific causes of death for family members who have passed away, any history of miscarriages or stillbirths or birth defects. We should also inquire about their ethnic background because, certain genetic conditions are more prevalent in certain populations.
Right.
For instance, sickle cell disease is more common in people of African descent. It's like detective work, piecing together these clues to assess the genetic risks.
Sounds like it. So what happens if we, as nurses, uncover some red flags during this, family history assessment? Do we start ordering genetic tests right away?
Not so fast. Our role is to educate and advocate, not to diagnose. So if we do uncover any red flags, our next step would be to refer the patient to a genetic specialist for further evaluation and counseling. We can help explain the different types of genetic tests that are available and help patients understand, the potential risks and benefits of each one.
So it's a collaborative approach.
It is.
Working hand in hand with genetic specialists.
Yes.
To make sure they're receiving the most appropriate care. What are some examples of the genetic tests that might be ordered?
Well, there are several, and it really depends on the situation. Carrier screening, for instance, can determine if a person carries a gene for a recessive disorder. And this is particularly important for couples who are planning a family because it lets them assess the risk of passing that disorder on to their children.
Right, like if both parents are carriers of cystic fibrosis.
Exactly. Then there are prenatal diagnostic tests, such as amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, which can detect chromosomal abnormalities or genetic disorders in a developing fetus. These tests are typically offered to women who are at an increased risk, like those over 35, or those with a family history of genetic conditions.
I imagine those tests can be pretty emotionally challenging for families, especially if they reveal difficult information.
They absolutely can. And it's important to remember that our role as nurses goes beyond just providing information. We need to be sensitive to the emotional impact of genetic testing and offer support throughout the process.
So what kind of support can we offer in those situations?
Well, we can start by simply listening attentively to their fears and concerns.
Okay.
We can answer their questions honestly and openly and make sure that they have all the information they need to make an informed decision. We can also help connect them with support groups or other resources that might be helpful. Sometimes just having someone to talk to who understands what they're going through can make all the difference.
It sounds like empathy and clear communication are really crucial skills for nurses who are working in this area. Being able to explain complex genetic concepts in a way that's understandable and providing emotional support when families are facing those difficult decisions. It's about finding that balance between knowledge and compassion and advocacy.
You hit the nail on the head. As nurses, we have a unique opportunity to empower patients with knowledge and support them as they navigate this increasingly complex world of genetics.
This deep dive is really emphasizing just how important it is for nurses to stay up to date on the latest advancements in genetics. It's a rapidly evolving field, and our knowledge needs to evolve with it.
Absolutely. Continuing education is key, and we shouldn't be afraid to reach out to genetic specialists for guidance and support. We're all in this together, working towards the same goal, providing the best possible care for our patients.
It's incredible to think how much our understanding of genetics has changed, even in recent years. What are some of the most exciting advancements that you've seen? What's on the horizon in this field?
One area I find particularly fascinating is Pharmacogenomics.
Pharmacogenomics. What's that?
It's all about how a person's genes can influence their response to medications. It has the potential to really revolutionize how we prescribe and administer drugs, leading to treatments that are more personalized and effective.
So less trial and error, more targeted therapy.
Exactly.
That would be incredible. It sounds like the future of healthcare is personalized medicine with genetics at the center of it all.
I think you're right, and nurses are going to be at the forefront of this transformation, using their knowledge of genetics to advocate for their patients and ensure that they are receiving the most appropriate and effective care possible.
It's definitely an exciting time to be a nurse, but with all these incredible advancements comes some pretty important ethical considerations as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. Things like privacy and confidentiality, those are huge issues when you're talking about something as personal as someone's genetic information.
It makes you wonder what happens to that information once it's out there. Who have access to it? Could it be used against someone, say by insurance companies or employers?
Those are very real concerns. And luckily, we do have laws in place like the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which helps to protect individuals from that type of discrimination based on their genetic information.
Okay, that's good to know. So GINA helps prevent discrimination when it comes to health insurance and employment. But does it cover everything? Are there still areas where genetic discrimination could occur?
Well, unfortunately, there are still some gaps. GINA mainly focuses on health insurance and employment, but it doesn't address other areas where genetic discrimination could potentially occur, like life insurance or long-term care insurance.
So there's still work to be done to ensure that there is comprehensive protection for everyone.
It also makes you think about the ownership of genetic information. Does it belong to the individual who is tested, the company that conducted the test, or is it part of, some larger research database? Who has the right to access and use that information?
Those are really complex questions, and society is still grappling with those. There are no easy answers, and it's definitely something that we need to continue discussing and debating as our understanding of genetics and the technology continues to advance.
And then there's the issue of informed consent. How do we make sure that patients truly understand the implications of genetic testing before they agree to it? Informed consent is paramount. We need to have very open and honest conversations with our patients. We need to ensure that they're fully informed about the potential benefits and the risks of testing. We need to clearly explain the types of information that might be revealed by these tests and the potential impact of those results. It's really about empowering patients to make informed decisions that are aligned with their own personal values and beliefs.
What about testing for conditions that don't have a cure? Like Huntington's disease, for example. Is it ethical to give someone that kind of information, knowing that it might cause them, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, but not really offer any solutions?
That's a really tough question, and one that often sparks a lot of debate. Some people really believe that knowledge is power, even if it's difficult knowledge to receive. They feel that it's better to be aware of the potential risks, even if there's nothing that can be done to prevent or to treat the condition. Others feel that it's better not to know, especially if there's no way to change the outcome. Ultimately, it's a very personal decision, and we need to respect individual choices and support our patients regardless of what they decide.
It sounds like genetic testing requires this really delicate balance, providing information and protecting patients from potential harm, both physical and emotional. It's not just about the science, it's about the human impact as well.
You're absolutely right. And as nurses, we have a responsibility to be aware of these ethical considerations and to advocate for our patients, always ensuring that their rights and well-being are protected. We need to be their guides, their allies in this incredibly complex landscape.
Wow, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's incredible how far we've come in our understanding of fetal development and genetics. But it's clear that there are still many challenges ahead, both scientifically and ethically.
Absolutely. But I think with open discussions and thoughtful consideration and a commitment to ethical practices, we can really harness the power of genetic knowledge to improve healthcare for everyone.
That's a great point, and I think that's the perfect place to wrap up our deep dive for today. We went from that first spark of life all the way to the complex implications of genetic testing. We really explored some thought-provoking topics. I hope that this has given our listeners, especially our student nurses and our faculty, a lot to think about. This is an area that's constantly evolving, and it's up to all of us to stay informed, to engage in these important conversations, and to advocate for ethical and compassionate care for all of our patients.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. It's been a fantastic discussion.
Until next time, everyone, keep those brains firing and never stop exploring the amazing world of science and healthcare. Thanks for joining us.